Hello again guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are taking a look at the Skunkworks TF-104 Starfighter. More menacingly known as the Widowmaker, the F-104 is an American built fighter interceptor aircraft. It's also one of my favourite aircraft and it's one that I've been looking forward to in Microsoft Flight Simulator for quite some time now. Skunkworks are a development team whose work I've enjoyed now for many years, mostly within Prepared. Of course though we had their Fiat G91 a year or so ago within Microsoft Flight Simulator. I generally really enjoy the feel and quality to their products, so again I've been looking forward to taking a look at the F-104, and that's exactly what we're going to do in today's flight. This video will be a full review, so as usual we'll take a look at both the internal and external modelling and texturing. We'll take the aircraft on a full flight from startup to shutdown, and then we'll finish up the review with my overall thoughts and opinions on the product. We're currently on the ground at China Lake Naval Air Station once again. Being an American aircraft, I thought we'd put the F-104 on a run around the Sidewinder route. The aircraft is currently cold and dark, so we'll run through all of the relevant checks there to get it started up. We'll depart out to the west, we'll fly the Sidewinder route through onto the Jedi Transition, and of course making our way through Star Wars Canyon. En route we'll carry out a few manoeuvres as well as a zoom climb as we head home towards China Lake. We'll then carry out the landing and a full shutdown and finish up the review. As always guys, I do hope you enjoy the video. If you do, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. If you have any comments or questions for me, you can leave those down in the comments section below, and as always I'll do my best to answer them. I'm sure that many of you will already agree with what you can see in front of you, but the F-104 is a pretty awesome piece of design, and I think that Skunkworks have done a really nice job recreating the aircraft. Let's take a look at that in a bit more detail though, and we'll continue on with our tour of the external modelling and texturing. So as I say, I think once again Skunkworks have done a very nice job with the TF-104, another really nice addition to the sim. I can't really put my finger on exactly why, but I feel that Skunkworks always do a really nice job of recreating a very authentic feeling aircraft in the sim. The modelling of the TF-104 I think is excellent, and as you can see they've gone to the trouble as well. They're giving us some pretty detailed ground equipment and various fixtures and fittings on the aircraft in a cold and dark state. As usual, I'll leave it to anyone more knowledgeable than myself to really look at the details of the aircraft in terms of the accuracy, but overall I think the external model is really nice. I couldn't really find any obvious flaws, no areas with low poly count, things of that nature. For me, I think the TF-104 looks excellent, but again I am slightly biased given that I really like the aircraft in general. Modelling detail throughout the aircraft is really rather nice. As you can see from the wheel well bay here, we've got various piping and cabling running throughout. And again, Skunkworks have gone to the effort of modelling the aircraft's shocks, what I assume is the high pressure air hose, as well as the pylon pins there. So overall I think the modelling is excellent, the texturing is very nice as well, it certainly holds up really well at a distance. In particular I think the PBR effects that Skunkworks have used hold up really well. The aircraft, particularly under certain lighting conditions, looks absolutely spot on, very photorealistic under many circumstances. The only criticism I would level at the aircraft, as you can see the texturing isn't particularly high resolution, so once you do get close in it's quite grainy in nature. Most of it's still just about legible, but overall certainly lower quality than many other aircraft that we now see in the sim. Again though, whilst the texturing can be rather grainy close up, overall at a distance I think the aircraft looks great. And Skunkworks have clearly put the effort in, as most of the text throughout the aircraft in terms of warning labels and various advisories seems to be there. Of course, being the TF-104, it's a tandem cockpit setup, the cockpit looking very nice externally, even better internally. So let's now head inside the aircraft and we'll take a brief look at the cockpit before we get the aircraft started up. Coming down into the front cockpit then, and I would say overall the internals of the aircraft are very much on a par with the externals. The cockpit has most of the same strengths and weaknesses as the externals on the aircraft. Generally speaking, the modelling is very well done, and the texturing, whilst not particularly high resolution in some areas, overall gives that really authentic feel to the aircraft once again. Zooming in a little bit closer to the panel, you can see that overall the gauges and the texturing looking really nice. Again, not perhaps quite as high resolution as some of the other aircraft that we've seen in the sim to date, but what I really like about most of the Skunkworks products that I own, you can see they do a really nice job with the weathering on the aircraft, and I think that's one of their secrets in terms of developing products which, as I say, for me, I think feel very authentic in terms of how they look. In terms of the cockpit modelling, no major errors there. As you can see, most of the switches and panels have been physically modelled. That being said, in terms of systems, the TF-104 broadly on a par with the Skunkworks G91. I would say there's probably around 60 to 80% of the systems working in the aircraft. There's quite a few that don't. So bearing in mind, I don't think that we could refer to the aircraft as study level, but I certainly think the systems implementation is strong enough that you can pretty well model flying the TF-104 accurately. Again, as with the SimSkunkWorks Fiat G91, we have a working PHI unit. We're actually not going to be taking too much of a look at that today. The TF-104 being a little bit more advanced, we also have a working INS unit. And one really nice feature that we have on the aircraft, we do actually get a working air-to-air and ground mapping radar. Again, we're not going to take too much of a look at that in today's flight. Firstly, I'm still not all that familiar with the unit, still getting to grips with it at the moment. And secondly, the radar actually uses external data as opposed to mapping what's actually in the sim, so it currently only works in a few geographical locations. And one last nice little piece of functionality within the sim, you can actually lock up and track AI traffic via the radar. And of course that's a little bit of a first within Microsoft Flight Simulator. As I mentioned, the TF-104 is a tandem cockpit layout, and as you can see the rear cockpit modelled just as nicely as the front cockpit. Again, the same levels of functionality there. Another nice touch, whether you choose to fly from the front or the back seat, you'll get the opposing pilot modelled within the cockpit. So depending on which seat you choose, you'll be able to see the instructor or the student pilot modelled. Of course, just a nice little enhancement there in terms of the immersion within the aircraft. So overall, once again, I think SimSkunkWorks have done a very nice job with the TF-104. In terms of systems modelling, the aircraft is very much where I expected it to be, and as usual, I think the best way to demonstrate that is we'll now carry out a full startup and flight in the TF-104. So welcome to the cockpit of the SimSkunkWorks TF-104. We just got ourselves strapped in as usual. We're currently working our way through the checklists. We're now down to the interior checks. The external power unit is connected, currently on. Left console circuit breakers are in. Emergency UHF radio is set off. UHF command radio is set to transmit. Stability control switches are on. APC cutout switch. Interestingly, the checklist calls for on at the moment, but the guarded position is off. We're just going to leave that off for now. Refueling switch is off and guarded. Fuel shutoff switch is guarded and the clip is in place. Auxiliary trim selector, currently not modelled in the aircraft, but we want that set to stick trim. Radar control panel is off. Wing flap lever is up. Throttle is off. Speed brake switch is in. Landing gear lever is down and the red light is out. Landing gear unsafe warning light is out. And on the landing gear indication we have 3 greens. Landing and taxi lights are off. Anti-skid switch is on. Drag chute handle is stowed. Armament control panel, we're not going to focus too much on that today as most of the functionality there is currently inoperative. Seems it's just the pylon lights, we can test those. Altimeter is set, clock is checked. Airspeed marker will set to 190, that'll be our takeoff speed at our current weight today. PHI is set, we're not going to be using that for today's flight. Standby attitude indicator, we'll set that up once the attitude indicator is erect. And the same for the attitude indicator, we'll check that once we've got the INS aligned. Accelerometer has been reset. Weapon selector is set to safe. Canopy jettison handle is stowed. Ram air turbine handle is stowed. Emergency nozzle closure handle is stowed. Storm lights, a little bit tricky to see there, but they are off. You'll notice there is a little bit of clipping there between the canopy handle and the main panel. External fuel quantity is checked. Worth noting at the moment, I think the external fuel quantity indicator switch is currently reversed. As you'll have seen from the external shots, we've got the tip tank selected. Currently the switch is in pylon there and showing a fuel load. As you can see in tip there, we're showing 0, so I think that switch is currently in the reverse sense. Generator switches are both on. Canopy defogger rheostat is set off. Fuel quantity test is checked. Liquid oxygen quantity, as you can see we've got full capacity there, we need at least 4 litres. Oxygen pressure gauge is checked. Oxygen system can come on. And we've got normal flow. Faceplate heat rheostat is off. Pressure suit valve lever can go on. TACAN will leave off. IFF master switch is off. DCU-9 Alpha currently doesn't seem to be modelled in the aircraft. As you can see, most of the switches there are not functional. Same for the dual timers. Inertial navigation control panel, that is set. And the fresh air scoop lever, again not currently modelled, but we want that in the closed position whilst on the ground. Cockpit temperature mode is set to auto, we'll leave it in cold for now. Pitot heat is off, engine duct anti-ice is off, rain removal is off. PHI navigation control, again we won't be using the PHI for the flight today. Lighting control panel, we'll get the beacon light on in preparation for the start. And the lights, I would set those to bright, but it seems the switch, although it's showing clickable, currently not operable. C2G compass, we should set that to mag and sync, but again that panel not currently operative. And rocket select switch is set. The line panel is set. So for the start, the ground turbine compressor is connected and on. We'll hit the start switch. And we can release, just waiting to come through 10% there on the RPM. And there's 10%, so we'll move the throttle into the idle detent. And just monitoring the engine there as it spools up. We should hit the start switch cutout at 40%, but that seems to automatically occur in the aircraft. And also through 40%, the ground power will be disconnected by the ground crew automatically. So we're stabilised at 67%. We're looking for a nozzle position between 8.5 and 9.5, currently showing 9.5. Exhaust gas temperature we're looking for between 320 and 420. And we're currently showing around 410 there at the moment, so that's checked. Oil pressure we're looking for a minimum of 12 psi. And we're currently up to about 35 there. And fuel flow we're looking for between 700 and 1600 pounds per hour. And currently showing around 600 there. So it looks like we have a good start. The start switches are off, and the after start checks will align the IRS so we can set to standby initially, and we have the amber light. We'll go into align, and just waiting until the green light goes out there. In reality, apparently it takes around 3 minutes, but Skunk works to cut it down to around 20 seconds. And as soon as the green light goes out, which it now has, we can go into the nav position. So the IRS has aligned, the attitude indicators are checked. Rain removal is checked. Optical sight, again not currently modelled in the aircraft unfortunately. Radar can go to standby. UHF is set. TACAN will leave off. IFF can go to normal. Engine duct anti-ice is not required. Speed brakes, we'll move those into the out position. We do get a little bit of airflow noise with the speed brakes extended there, which is obviously slightly unusual given that we're on the ground. Usually we'd have the ground engineer check those. We should see a slight drop in hydraulic pressure there as well apparently when operating the air brakes, but we don't get that in the aircraft currently. So the before taxi checks, the pitot heat can come on. Anti-skid switch is on. Flaps, we'll set those to landing initially, just to check operation. And we do have land there on the indicators. We'll come back to the takeoff position. And we're showing takeoff. Again, we get the ground crew to verify. Emergency nozzle closure system will check. So the throttle is in the idle position. Emergency nozzle closure will pull. And you can see the nozzle closing there. We're looking between 1 and 3. We've currently got about 2.2 there. So we can push that back in. And again, we're checking for a good nozzle position indication, which we have. On the INS, that is set to nav. Ejection seat pin has been removed. We'd show that to the ground crew. He'd show us the external source safety pin, and we can close up the canopy. Lastly, we get the ground crew to remove the wheel chocks, and we are now ready for the taxi. Okay, so the park brake can come off. We'll take the taxi light on, although it seems currently we only have the option between off or landing lights. We'll take the landing lights though. We'll be airborne fairly shortly, of course. And we'll come up on the power. Nice short taxi for us. The holding point's just out at our 1 o'clock, as you can see. So we'll just turn right onto the main taxiway. Come off the throttle again, do a quick brake check. Brakes are good. Anti-skid switch is on. Flight instruments and navigation systems will check in the turn. And again, just coming up on the throttle to keep the aircraft moving. It's all clear on the left. Overall, the TF-104 very easy to taxi. Very responsive in terms of nose wheel steering. It's fairly easy to tip the aircraft, but it does have quite a narrow undercarriage, I suppose, so that's possibly quite realistic. Some nice glare there off the mirrors as we come around to the holding point. And we'll just stop short. Park brake can come on. So the before takeoff checks. Fuel quantities are checked. Wing flaps are in the takeoff position. Speed brakes are in. Canopy is locked and the warning light is out. Oxygen is checked. Radios, IFF and TACAN are set. Defogger is checked. Stabilizer, takeoff trim light will trim accordingly until we see the green light there. And we have the stabilizer light green. Anti-collision light is on. We'll set our external lights to flash. Pitot heat is on. Engine anti-ice is not required. And we are now ready to get ourselves lined up, so we'll come off the parking brake once again and just taxi ourselves into position. It's all clear on final. And as you can see there, making a turn at relatively high speed, the aircraft definitely wanting to lean over to the right there, so you do have to be fairly careful in the taxi. Okay, so just before we depart, we're going to set the PHI into TCM, which I presume stands for TACAN. That's just going to give us basically a directional indicator. We'll hold the aircraft on the brakes and we'll come up to full military power. And feet off the brakes. We'll come into full afterburner. Overall, the aircraft feels reasonable on the takeoff. The rudder, not too bad in terms of sensitivity. Looking to come back on the stick just a little bit before our rotate speed. And pitching for about 5 degrees, flying the aircraft off the runway. And we're up. Tap the brakes, the gear can come up. TF-104 is pretty twitchy on the controls, quite sensitive. And just come out through 300 knots, we'll take the flaps up. And the flaps indicating up. We'll start to turn out towards the west. And we'll come back to around 95% on the RPM. So we'll just get ourselves established, tracking westbound out towards Lake Isabella. We'll carry out the after takeoff checks once we've done that. And again, the aircraft very sensitive on the controls, needing very minor control inputs here just to keep us coming around the turn and more or less straight and level. Having to be quite proactive on the trim as well, which according to the manual is quite realistic for the real world aircraft. Anyway, so that's got us tracking out to the west. We'll refine our heading in just a moment's time. Trimmed nicely here for just a very shallow climb. So the after takeoff checks, landing gear is up, lights are out, wing flaps are up, indicating up, throttle is set, engine instruments are checked, fuel quantity is checked, oxygen is checked and set, altimeter is set, and that's the after takeoff checks complete. So as I say, we'll continue to track outbound towards Lake Isabella. Current heading looks pretty good at the moment. We just need to come over the tops of the hills here. The lake will be on the other side of the mountain range. So it's coming up through 450 knots. Lake Isabella should be just over the other side of these hills off our 11 o'clock. Overall, the aircraft very pleasant to fly. Maybe just a little bit lacking in a feeling of weight compared to some of the best aircraft that we've seen in the sim. I so far would compare the TF-104 very much on a par with the Skunk Works G91. It is a really nice aircraft, but it wouldn't quite tick all the boxes for study level, I would say. So there's Lake Isabella just off the nose. We'll continue to track outbound for now. We'll keep 95% on the RPM, and then we'll come up to full afterburner once we start the run. As you can see, the TF-104 pushing 500 knots here. We are in a slight descent, but not really breaking a sweat here. We're using 95% RPM still. It's a very speedy aircraft, as you'd expect. Fuel flow at the moment, we're looking at about 7,000 pounds an hour. We'll talk more about the fuel burn later on. We're going to carry out a climb once we head back to China Lake, and it seems as though at the moment fuel burn doesn't really seem to change with altitude. Not sure whether or not that's an aircraft issue or a sim issue. I know that there are quite a few peculiarities in the sim at the moment in terms of various features to do with engine modelling, particularly things like fuel flow. Anyway, just coming up overhead Lake Isabella, that's the start of the Sidewinder route. We're doing 500 knots currently. And we just want to track up the river out to the north, which you can see off to our 2 o'clock there at the moment. We'll get ourselves tracking northbound before we come onto the afterburner. And it'll be interesting to see how the aircraft handles at high speed. So coming out to the north, pulling about 3G there in the turn. And we'll put the throttle into the afterburner detent. You can hear the afterburner kicking in there. And you can see the fuel flow now right up around 11,500 pounds of fuel. Anyway, as I say, we'll track out to the north, out towards waypoint 1. And just following the course of the river for now, more or less out towards waypoint 1 itself. So far the aircraft feels much the same in terms of how it flies. We're now doing 650 knots. Again, very pleasant to fly. I just feel it's maybe, wouldn't say that it's too light on the controls. Obviously I have no frame of reference for how the TF-104 actually flies, and again, according to the devs, it is pretty light on the controls, but I would just say maybe it's more of a sound issue than anything. There's not a whole lot of feedback in terms of how the aircraft feels, as you can see for yourselves. Expect a little bit more as we make our manoeuvres there. And currently the aircraft is still using legacy sounds. That is mentioned by Skunk Works themselves. Hopefully they'll do the same as they did with the G91 and give us some WY sounds later on. Although there is no mention of that in the manual, so that's just a hope and speculation on my part at the moment. So we'll just go inverted, put the aircraft into a little bit of a dive here, get us back towards the ground. You can certainly feel that if you were too aggressive on the controls in pitch and putting the aircraft through high angles of attack, it would probably bite you pretty quickly, which again I believe is very true to life of the real world F-104. Obviously the aircraft did not get the name of the Widowmaker for nothing. Waypoint 1 just coming off the nose, that's out at our 11 o'clock. I believe in reality there's a little watchtower or something up on the side of the hill there, but obviously that's not currently modelled in the sim. Anyway, we'll continue the rest of this part of the run in a more cinematic fashion, and I'll come back to you again once we're ready to make the Jedi transition down through Star Wars Canyon. Okay, so as you can see, we're just coming up on the lakes here at waypoint 2. Slight change of plan, we're actually going to carry out our manoeuvring now. Save us a little bit of time later on. So first thing we'll do, we'll put the aircraft into a stall, see how it behaves there. Expecting it to behave very aggressively. The 104 not known for its kind handling at high angles of attack. Just build up a little bit of altitude here, coming up through 18,000 feet. We'll cut the power. And you can see our equivalent angle of attack indicator there just starting to nudge up. Coming back through 220 knots. Coming up on 2 units on the equivalent angle of attack indicator there. And coming up through 25,000 feet. So full back on the stick, we're through 140 knots now. And the real world aircraft should pitch up uncontrollably more or less, which it has. So that's pretty good to see. Have to excuse the camera there. Yeah, so overall, again, a little bit sedate in terms of sound and feedback from the aircraft. No buffeting, no shaking, anything of that nature, but overall the behaviour was correct. We eventually lost the aircraft in a pitch up attitude there, so that's pretty good to see. Come back up on the power, we'll try a couple of high rate of turn manoeuvres. And yeah, pretty much straight away there, the aircraft just dropping the wing, more or less entering into a spin. Fairly sedate, I will say, but nonetheless it does behave more or less as you would expect. And as soon as we come off the controls, they're actually pretty easy to recover from. But nonetheless, I have to say, I've got to be pretty careful here coming out of the manoeuvre. I can feel the aircraft otherwise would probably just want to go back into the same state. Come all the way back up to full afterburner. See if we can't put the aircraft through a loop. So overall, I would say that the flight modelling ticks all the boxes in terms of how it performs, not necessarily to the numbers, but in terms of behaviour. It just feels a little bit sterile in terms of any feedback from the aircraft, as I mentioned, which is a little bit of a shame. But again, hopefully Skunk Works will continue to work on the sounds, and then that'll obviously make the aircraft feel a little bit more alive. Yeah, we're just going to make a very shallow loop here, just to give us plenty of altitude before we come through the top. Start coming back on the stick a little bit more now. Don't want to bleed off too much speed. And coming through the top. Yeah, the aileron authority now feeling pretty appalling as we get back through about 230 knots there, again as you would expect. And we'll cut the power. I love the whine there as we roll off on the engine. And again, back up on the power now. Yeah, so overall, as I said, I think the flight model is nice. I think the aircraft more or less behaves as one would expect. Again, obviously no frame of reference with the real-world TF-104, but it just needs a little bit more work in terms of feedback and ambience in the aircraft, I think. Anyway, we'll leave the aircraft in full afterburner. We'll make our way out towards Star Wars Canyon. And then we'll follow the lake bed back towards China Lake. And as we do so, as I say, we'll make a high rate of climb. Again, pulling some G here, coming around the corner, we can see Star Wars Canyon just off the nose. And about 550 knots there as we enter into the canyon itself. The aircraft's still very light on the controls even at high speed, although it's definitely a little bit more difficult to control. You can see getting quite a bit of buffeting here as well. So through the canyon, and now we'll just track, as I said, southbound along the lake. So we'll pitch up, we'll go into a climb. We're looking for about 0.9 Mach for the climb, and we're currently there already, so we'll just pitch up to maintain speed. We'll leave a little bit of bank on just to put us on our correct heading. And as you'd expect, getting an absolutely stonking rate of climb here out of the TF-104 at the moment, well over 6,000 feet per minute. Just coming up through 10,000 feet. Just keep an eye on that fuel flow though. We're currently doing about just over £11,000 per hour in terms of fuel burn. And you'll notice that doesn't roll back at all as we climb. Anyway, pretty much on a good heading back towards China Lake now, so we'll roll wings level. Still maintaining about 0.9 here on the Mach number at the moment. And as you can see, that fuel flow is still pegged currently. Again, I don't know if that's a sim issue or an aircraft issue. Not necessarily a huge deal for some, but it obviously shows that there's fairly simplistic modelling going on there in terms of the engine. As you'd expect, you can get up to altitude quite quickly, quite nicely in the TF-104. Obviously, high rate of climb is really one of the F-104's fortes. Anyway, we won't climb any higher since China Lake's not too far off in front of us. We'll be descending again to come back to the field. We might just be able to make it out at our 1 o'clock at the moment. Come off the power, we'll get the aircraft descending again. And as you can imagine, with those stubby little wings, the F-104 glides about as well as the space shuttle, more or less, I think it's fair to say. Again, really nice sound effects on the engine in terms of the particular characteristics of the F-104. You can hear the whine there, and you'll obviously have heard the whine as well with the external shots of the aircraft. Anyway, idle thrust here, we're doing 350 knots in the descent and we're doing well over 6,000 feet per minute rate of descent here to maintain that. So as I said, the TF-104 is certainly no glider. I don't think anyone would be too surprised to hear that. Come up on the power here just to shallow off our descent. And running through the descent checklists, engine and duct anti-icing is not required. Altimeter is set. Fuel quantity is checked. As you can see, we've got about 4,000 pounds of fuel still currently on board, which is going to be more than enough to make the approach. In terms of our landing speed, that gives us an approach speed of around 200 knots and a landing speed of around 180. We'll set that on the index. And oxygen is set. So that's the descent checklist complete. We'll carry out some of the before landing checks as well, just to lighten up our workload later on. So sight is caged and off, again not currently modelled. Radar can come off. The radar only currently works in certain geographical locations. Armament switch is off and set to safe. And the wing flaps, we can take those below 450 knots, so we'll come to the takeoff flaps now. Again, the TF-104 really doesn't handle very well at low speed, so good to get the flaps out as soon as you can. We're just going to make a straight-in approach back onto runway 21. You can see we're already pretty much on a base leg here. And again, we'll come off the power. We need to be back below 240 before we can take landing flaps. Start thinking about taking the gear as well. And a really interesting quirk on the 104 in general. The aircraft actually uses bleed air over the wing just to increase its lift, and we have to keep the engine power up to make sure that we have enough bleed air going over the wing. If we don't, you'll actually see that we do get a wing drop in the aircraft, which is nicely modelled by some Skunk works, I have to say. Again, they've gone to the effort of modelling all of the peculiarities of the aircraft, which is really nice to see. So gear is down, we have 3 greens. And showing landing flap. I'll just take off the throttle for a moment, just to give you an idea. So you can see there the left wing wanting to drop quite aggressively as well. So you do have to really pay attention to the aircraft at low speeds. And we need to keep the engine above 83% really to maintain that decent supply of bleed air. So we've got 85% at the moment, still trimming the aircraft. We'll maintain 200 knots down the approach. And again, the aircraft definitely feeling a little bit of a handful at low speed, which is nice to see. Just coming up on the power to maintain our 200 knots. Basically, we want to maintain 200 knots. Once we're over the threshold, we'll cut the throttle, expecting to touch down around 180. We'll take the speed brake as well, just to kill the ground effect, get the aircraft on the ground. And once we're down, we'll take the drag chute. So again, the aircraft pretty light on the controls, really having to use quite a bit of aileron adjustment here just to keep the wings level. So just starting to come back on the stick, we'll hold the aircraft off, cutting the power. We'll take the air brake. And we'll take the drag chute. And we'll vacate off to the left. Okay, so we're just making our way back in towards our parking area. The flaps can go back to takeoff. Pitot heat can come off. And you can see our bay just off on the right. Ejection seat pin has been inserted. Rain removal is off. Radar is off. Trim is set. Canopy is locked. We'll leave the anti-collision light on until we've shut the engine down. And we'll just swing out to the right here, we'll come back around, we'll line the aircraft up once again, broadly with our ground equipment. And the ground crew are going to have to do a little bit of work there just to bring the steps and the ground cart back up to the aircraft. Anyway, the shutdown checks, flaps can come up. Inertial navigation system can go off. All electrical equipment needs to go off before the shutdown, so UHF radio can go off. Radar is off. Get the anti-skid and the taxi light off. And just work our way around the cockpit. Pressure suit and oxygen supply can go off. IFF is off. Lights can go back to steady. And again, we'll leave the beacon until the engine's shut down. So all electrical equipment is off. Temperature rheostat is set. Engine has been running for 3 minutes at idle. So we'll come to the fuel shut off and we'll cut the fuel supply. In reality, you'd actually bring the throttle back, but at the moment, according to SimSkunkWorks, you either need to assign a key or you can just use the fuel shut off as we did there. So the throttle is in the off position. Ejection seat safety pin is installed. Weapon systems are off. Pressure suit and oxygen supply are off. External stores auto drop safety pins have been installed by the ground crew. We'll open up the canopy. And that's our flight in the TF-104 complete. So there you go guys, I do hope you enjoyed our run around the Sidewinder route in the SimSkunkWorks TF-104G. Hopefully you've already got a good feel for the product yourselves, but as usual I'll try and give you a little bit of a breakdown on the strengths and weaknesses of the product, and give you my overall opinions on how I think the 104 stacks up. Overall, I think there's lots of positive things to say about the TF-104. There are a few negative things as well, of course. As usual, we'll start with the negatives, work our way through to the positives. I think for me, at the moment, the only thing I could be significantly critical about is, as I mentioned during the flight, I think the aircraft's just lacking a little bit of vibrancy at the moment in terms of feedback, in terms of sound. As you'll have heard for yourselves, overall the engine sounds are excellent, and most of the cockpit switches have pretty decent sounds as well. The aircraft is still using the legacy sound engine at the moment, and that does show in a few areas. Skunk did do the same with their G91, initially releasing the aircraft with legacy sounds, and later uploading some more modern sounds to their website. Apparently this is done due to licensing issues, which is absolutely fine. The only thing that concerns me slightly there is they don't make any mention in the manual this time of producing more modern sounds at a later date. Once again though, the sounds overall are very good in their current state. It's just to me the aircraft feels a little bit dead when manoeuvring. In terms of manoeuvring, flight model, I wouldn't say it's a negative point. I don't necessarily know whether or not it's accurate to the TF-104. Skunkworks do advertise that their TF-104 has a quote-unquote study level flight model. Again, I can't really say whether or not that's true. I would say though that the aircraft felt much the same in terms of handling both at high and low speed. Overall the aircraft is nice to fly but light on the controls. Again, I don't know how accurate or not that is to the real world aircraft. The rest of the issues I found in relation to flight modelling, again I'm not sure whether or not that's specific to the aircraft or the sim itself. We've already discussed the fuel burn at increasing altitude, either that's an issue with the gauge or the aircraft itself. Similarly, I thought the aircraft felt a little bit strange on touchdown. Obviously we deployed the drag chute, but it almost felt as if the brakes were coming on, as was an issue initially with the Skunkworks Fiat G91. There are no weapons available with the aircraft, which is a little bit of a shame. Skunkworks do state obviously the TF-104 is a training aircraft, and frankly it was just easier for them to comply with the no weapons policy that Asobo has on the marketplace. I can see why they went down that route, but again it is a little bit of a shame since they did a really nice job in terms of the weaponry and armaments with the G91. And I've been quite enjoying the fact that third-party developers have been releasing fully fledged products outside of the marketplace. I do hope that we're not going to see them starting to kowtow to Asobo's stipulations. Again though, with the aircraft being the TF-104, I'm not too bothered about the lack of weapons overall. Another little bug with the aircraft at the moment, as we saw we do get internal pilot models, which is really nice to see. One issue currently, if you do flick in and out between the internal and external view, you'll actually find that the pilot seat you're occupying will also display the pilot model. One could argue that's actually quite a nice feature to have. I'm certainly a big fan of having internal pilot models, for example as we see in DCS. I think it really ramps up the immersion. At the moment though, as the pilot's head is also modelled, you'll find that it will clip in and out of your vision. It's an easy enough issue to correct. All you need to do is flick back and forth between a couple of the cockpit cameras and then the pilot models will correct themselves. But again, just a little bug that needs fixing up there at the moment. My last minor negative for the product, and really it falls into almost neutral territory. As we saw earlier, Skunkworks have given the TF-104 some really nice ground equipment. Currently, to configure the aircraft, you'll actually need to use an external application that you'll have to start up outside of the sim. It's a little bit buried away inside the community folder. Obviously, you could create a shortcut for it. It's a little bit of a clunky method though for interacting with the aircraft in the sim. You will have to switch in and out of the sim, for example, to start up the ground air cart. Again, it was the same with the Fiat G91, but it would be really nice to see Skunkworks introduce some sort of a tablet, as we've seen on many other add-ons within the sim. And that way, obviously, you can configure and interact with the aircraft in sim and not break the immersion having to tab in and out. Anyway, that's really all I have in terms of negatives for the aircraft. Certainly nothing major there. Again, I would just like a little bit more ambience in terms of cockpit sounds whilst manoeuvring the aircraft. FS Realistic does actually somewhat help in this department, but I chose not to use it for today's video for fairly obvious reasons. Just before we move on to the positives, in terms of the aircraft's FPS, overall it's pretty strong. I was losing about 3 FPS versus the default Cessna 152. So overall the F-104 a very frame rate friendly aircraft. It should work quite nicely on moderate systems as well, and hopefully of course in VR. Coming now onto the positives, I think overall it's been very clear throughout the video. The TF-104 a really stunning piece of visual work from Skunkworks. Modelling, as we mentioned, internally and externally, I think really well done. And texturing, with perhaps the exception of it being slightly lower resolution than one might like, I think is really great. I really like the authentic weathering and colouring on the aircraft, and again I think it creates a very authentic, very realistic feeling airframe. Visually, as I mentioned, I think the ambience in the aircraft is right up there with the very best. Sounds I'm also going to put into the positive category as well as the negative. Whilst there are deficiencies in the sound, as I mentioned, overall I think the engine sounds are absolutely excellent. The TF-104 is a really nice sounding aircraft, And SimSkunkWorks have done a great job as well of really getting those characteristic noises of the airframe in. We get that wonderful F-104 howl amongst other things. Systems overall I would say are certainly a positive of the aircraft. Again, not fully functional, there are plenty of systems that aren't operative. But overall all of the basics are covered and then some. Having that working radar as well, a really nice touch. Again, I like the fact that SimSkunkWorks have bothered to include internal pilot models. I think that ramps up the immersion in the aircraft. And overall throughout the product there are a lot of nice touches. SimSkunkWorks have clearly gone to the effort, put in a lot of love and passion with the TF-104. Most of the characteristic behaviours of the aircraft seem to be there. We saw with the stall, for example, that we did get the pitch up. I think overall the stall was a little bit sterile, there was no buffeting, no noise there. Comparing with the P3D version of the SimSkunkWorks F-104, the aircraft's behaviour in P3D, even at just relatively low speed, was much more aggressive in terms of its snapping on you. Although the Microsoft Flight Simulator version can still be a handful, and you certainly need to be careful at low speed, overall you can get away with a lot more than you could in the P3D variant. But as I say, lots of nice characteristic behaviours there. We saw the stall, we saw the wing drop there when bringing off the engine power on final. Also, you'll probably have noticed from some of the external shots the tip tanks there fluttering when pulling G. So again, it's really nice to see that SimSkunkWorks have gone to the effort of modelling all of these little peculiarities of the TF-104. It goes a long way to giving the aircraft some character and really making it feel the part. As I mentioned at the start of the video, the SSW TF-104, an aircraft that I've been looking forward to in Microsoft Flight Simulator for quite some time now. Overall it certainly doesn't disappoint. I very much enjoyed my time out in the aircraft. And really the only area once again that I would like to see SimSkunkWorks continue to develop is the sound. I could be wrong, but I think it's the sound engine just holding the aircraft back slightly, not making it feel quite as alive as I was hoping it would. Anyway guys, that just about wraps it up for today's video. Once again, I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider giving it a like. If you want to see more content from the channel, then please consider subscribing as well. Again, if you have any comments or questions for me, you can leave those down in the comments section below. As ever, a huge thank you to my channel members and patrons for all of your support. Very much appreciated. I hope that all of you are having a great day wherever you are. Take really good care, and I will see you all again soon.